equipped for the Falklands War, but they'd won. He said that besides the 70 to 80 Argentine planes shot down, 50 aircraft had been found damaged on various Falklands airstrips. 6 helicopters were now working for Britain, and 16,000 rounds had been fired from the 105mm artillery. Michael Nicholson was in Port Stanley when it fell.
General Jeremy Moore, Commander Land Forces, was into Stanley soon after them to accept the surrender. And after 4 hours of what was loosely described as negotiations, the surrender document was signed by him and the Argentine garrison commander, General Mario Menendez. It read as follows. In Port Stanley at 9 p.m., 14th of June 1982, Major General Menendez surrendered to me all Argentine forces in East and West Falklands together with their impedimenta. Arrangements are in hand to assemble them for their return to the Argentine, to gather their arms and equipment, and to mark and make safe their munitions. The Falkland Islands are once more under the government desired by their inhabitants. And it ended, God save the Queen. Just after midnight British time, with the niceties of surrender settled, General Moore went to the hospital and met the nurses who'd remained there throughout the shelling.
General, were you surprised at the speed, 3 weeks or so from start to finish, it took you to reach Stanley?
No, I don't think I was surprised. Clearly the enemy was surprised. He was surprised because quite clearly he hadn't expected us to land that far away and therefore had not really defended the area. I think that the reason it could be done was because he simply didn't understand that our troops would be able to do that.
The troops themselves were able to manage out in the mountains. You came across the way which presumably nobody expected you would be able to take.
Clearly he didn't expect us to come across that way. Clearly he didn't expect, and one of my officers who speaks extremely good Spanish has been talking to a number of them, and they believe that we came across because we had enormous numbers of helicopters. They'd simply find it difficult, if not impossible, to believe that actually, as you know, some of the units simply marched the whole way. And that is having troops of the quality one does have. We had plenty of ammunition with the force to have gone on a long time, but any operation is a matter of judgment, and we were having to balance the ability of even our extremely good and experienced troops, many of whom are Arctic trained, to withstand the conditions in the mountains against having the ideal amount of ammunition to continue a battle for a very long time. As the Duke of Wellington said after Waterloo, it was a damn fine thing, or a damn close run thing. Similarly here, in some ways, this was a close run thing, in that batteries of guns which started that final night with 400 rounds a gun were down to as few as 6. And it was, as you realize, a tremendous problem getting all that stuff all this way. And with the losses that were suffered on the way of a great deal of engineer equipment and for instance, a large proportion of our heavy lift helicopters, it was an astonishing performance by the logisticians. Back to Wellington again, and the way he described the systems of the French and British armies of his time, that the French system was like a fine harness, and it was beautiful to look at, and it worked very well until something went wrong. But once the leather broke, the leather had broken. The British one was made of rope, and when that broke, you tied a knot. Well, we tied a lot of knots this time, and it kept going.
There's also the question of casualties. They were, in human terms, that's dreadful. In military terms, they were quite light, weren't they? What do you attribute that to?
I would attribute that to, basically, the quality, skill, and determination of the young men in the formation I had the privilege to command. I think you would agree with me that if anybody has a go back home about the quality of the youth in our country, they ought to have seen these guys. They were absolutely tremendous. And having real determination and getting really stuck into it in the long run is the way to save casualties, of course.
As you came close to the town, you had civilians, you had civilian houses, you had a battle going on around them. Was it difficult to pick your way around that?
That was undoubtedly a problem, and of course we came here in order to help the people of these islands. That, as I see it, is the basic difference between ourselves and the Argentines. They were fighting for the islands, and we were fighting for the islanders. Clearly, the problem was that as they withdrew into the town and withdrew more and more of their equipment into the town and were putting guns in the town, it made it very difficult to get at those guns and to prevent them from causing us unnecessary casualties and so on without endangering civilians. We tried very hard. As you know, I got it wrong on one occasion, and that's my responsibility, and of course I'm extremely sorry that it happened. And with our naval gunfire support one night, we did kill some civilians. I thought that the civilians were all in a particularly well-defined area of the town, and therefore we were free to engage the other areas. On that occasion, I'm afraid I got it wrong.
And what quality were your opponents?
We've mentioned the Air Force, who were extremely courageous and very good. The regular members of the Argentine Army and Marine Corps were also, I think, very good. Their artillery was skillfully handled. Their men manning the machine guns, like the one you mentioned, were extremely skillful and very determined and stayed there and jolly well had to be winkled out. Their ordinary conscript soldiers' heart was certainly not in it. And you, I think, also will have seen much evidence that that was so. And they had to be held in their position by their officers. And really, they were not very high quality. But that doesn't alter the fact that it required a great deal of very determined fighting by our people to winkle out the ones who were extremely good.
What was it that produced that surrender and that collapse? It seemed just to happen.
I've never witnessed an event like that before, but I joined the services after the end of the war. I've not witnessed such a thing, so I don't really think I could say what it is. It is obviously the collapse of will, which is arrived at some point. And I suppose in all major campaigns that one has come across through history, there comes a point where there is a collapse of will, and suddenly it spreads. It's astonishing the speed with which it spreads, isn't it? A fascinating morning that was. We had I'd just been up in the mountains with the two brigadiers discussing what we were going to do next, and I'd given my orders, and they were about to start the next phase. And suddenly there they were, all over the hills, standing up and coming out of their holes and things, and we just stopped firing and held everything. It was a touch-and-go business because we had an airstrike coming in, and of course it was quite a difficult business to get to the pilot in the aeroplane to hold it off. But suddenly they just weren't fighting anymore, were they? Fascinating.
Tuesday, 15th of June. It was difficult to accept in those first daylight hours, looking at the state of Port Stanley, that the Argentines had been here for less than 3 months and that the British landing was less than a month ago. Stanley looked and felt as if it had been at war so much longer. And it was obvious from what they'd brought with them that the Argentines thought they'd come to stay, even to the point of renaming streets and buildings in Spanish for the convenience of their troops. Thankfully, the Royal Marines quickly began to put things right. Men who had been here when the Argentines invaded on April the 2nd and had defended Government House returned there that first morning of peace and raised the flag over the building they'd tried so hard to defend. It is easy to criticize an enemy in defeat, easy to believe the half-truths that were rapidly beginning to circulate around Stanley. But it is true to say that the Argentines have not left the capital as they found it. Their filth and vandalism is everywhere. It looked as if they'd been under siege for 12 months instead of 2. Proper hygiene must have been difficult in a garrison of 7 or more thousand men, but it wasn't helped by turning the floor of the post office into a public lavatory, with 3 months' excreta to be hosed away by Stanley's fire brigade. And the narrow streets were used as much as rubbish dumps as thoroughfares, with rotting food and unwanted discarded equipment littering the gutters. The Argentines had an odd way of impressing the Falklanders to the Argentine way of life. The Argentine cause is not helped by our confirmation that they placed one of their most lethal weapons, the 155mm long-range guns, deliberately in between people's houses, knowing how loath the British would be to fire back on them. The Argentine cause can't have been helped by placing their anti-aircraft guns in the school playground. It cannot be helped by painting the Red Cross on a white background on any house that suited them. They knew, of course, that it is the internationally respected symbol of immunity, the protection from attack. And yet they painted it on houses in which they garrisoned their senior officers and on houses in which they stored ammunition. The school itself had been turned into an arms dump. There has to be something in the Geneva Convention or some such code of war that forbids it. The weapons of war are stacking high, and as one pile is gathered up and stored away, so another takes its place. A lot will be destroyed, but what is in good condition will become ours to use. As one British Army officer put it to me, the Argentine junta must be made to lose money as well as face. Certainly, their Falklands expedition is going to cost them. Their garrison was well stocked, and when we realized what had been available to them, we were grateful that the only thing they lacked was the will to fight. Wednesday, the 16th of June. The prisoners seem to have accepted their defeat without any outward malice. Almost the reverse. They seem relieved to be out of it. Mostly young, mostly conscripts, mostly wondering why anyone, least of all them, should want to fight over such cold, wet Antarctic islands. Better the pampas and warm sunshine of their motherland. Descriptions by some very senior British officers about the condition of the prisoners did not match mine, and I reckon to have seen many thousands of them by now. None looked, in the words of those officers, as if they'd just come out of Belsen. And I've met no one who has seen or who has heard second-hand of Argentine soldiers taking meat bones from dogs. No doubt those men out in the field who'd spent weeks on patrol or were stuck up high in a mountain on observation posts did suffer. But then so did our men doing the same job. It seems to me we must be careful not to overdo our peacetime propaganda. But the problem is to keep them fit and well. It would have been no problem at all if General Galtieri had shown some sense of urgency, some anxiety to have them home. But while the junta fought amongst itself and the removal of General Galtieri was being arranged, the passage of these prisoners home was delayed. And whoever was president by the time they got home would still find their arrival embarrassing. Nothing could be more humiliating for him and his junta than the arrival of 10,000 men without victory, without their guns, without even their bootlaces. A defeated army returning to their motherland. The prisoners who suffered the worst humiliation were those waiting out on the airstrip. It had become their open prison. Thousands of them standing, sitting, wandering aimlessly about in the rain and biting winds. Some lived in tents, mostly the NCOs. Others lived under any kind of makeshift shelter they can find, from oil drums, bits of damaged aircraft, some even in the cockpits of smashed aircraft. Anywhere to keep dry. and surviving, like all defeated armies in the first days of defeat, as best they could. They moved only as fast as the British military could process them to the waiting ships. And the road that led from the airstrip to the harbour in Stanley was jammed with them. Long, shuffling lines of men, cold, miserable, human litter of war. It reminded me of the Egyptian retreat after their war against Israel in 1967. But more important, some people here would say, was the welfare of our own men, especially the Royal Marines commandos who'd borne the brunt of the fighting since D-Day, May 21st, living in trenches that filled with water that turned to ice, in trenches on mountains that filled with snow that turned to ice, living and sleeping a 24-hour day in sub-zero temperatures and maintaining what the generals called battle preparedness. That is, despite a hungry tummy, wet feet and frozen fingers, you're ready to fight. These men, too, needed to come in from the cold. As the Marines warmed up, the paras remembered their dead in a Thanksgiving service at Stanley Cathedral. They were reminded by their padre, David Cooper, that they had much to be thankful for.
When we were on the Norland, you remember we had a service not long before we went down onto the car deck to embark on the LCUs to become the 1st Battalion to assault these shores. I was also going to add the 1st Battalion to break out of the beachhead, the 1st Battalion to engage the enemy sensibly, and the 1st Battalion to march into Stanley, to para. However... You are not the same person, I'm not the same person that I was, or that you were, when we were on the Norland. We have all experienced events in the last 4 weeks that have probably changed our lives considerably. When you hear the whistle of something coming in, you're not sure what it is, but you know it's nasty. Or you've got a bit of cover, and you know that you're going to have to get up and move, and there's somebody trying to kill you, then you begin to see what the priorities are in life. You begin, perhaps even, to talk to God. But when you're faced with these stark realities, I think you would be a very insensible person if you didn't think more profoundly than perhaps you ever have in your life before. Certainly, people have said to me, you know, I've learnt more about myself in the last 10 minutes than I've learned in my entire life so far. What I would ask you to remember is what you felt when you thought you were going to die, and what was important to you then. It may have been your wife, it may have been your girlfriend, it may have been your dog. It may even have been your life itself. But remember, when the chips are down, that's what's important. And when life becomes easy again, and these realities become obscured, just remember that when you did have your back against the wall, spiritually, mentally, when things did cause you to think very, very hard about what really mattered, remember how much God figured in that. And don't forget. And remember who was important to you. And when you get home, and you've been back home 4 or 5 weeks, and you're beginning to take your wife or your girlfriend or your dog for granted, well, just remember, think on, as I say, in the part of the world that fellow Gerard and I come from, what is important, and try to model and mould your life on that. Because if that's what's seen you through to this, then it won't do you any harm in seeing you through the rest of your life. Sandra, remember those who will not be going home with us. Those who we lost at Goose Green and Darwin. Those whom we lost from Mount Longdon on to Radio Ridge. And we think and pray for their loved ones to whom they will not return.
Thursday the 17th, now is the time to tidy up and repair. First on the list of priorities was the water pumping station blown up by the Argentines as they surrendered. The Royal Engineers began work on it immediately. As important to the military was the repairs to the runway at the airstrip. British bombing raids by RAF Vulcans and Royal Naval Sea Harriers had done enormous damage, though not as much to the actual runway as we'd first been told. The Vulcans had come all the way down from Ascension Island, 4,000 miles away, but in their 3 raids, and of the 63 bombs dropped, only 1 hit the runway. It was the Sea Harriers off the carriers HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible that did the real damage. The Pucaras, the Argentine ground attack aircraft, the ones British troops thought they would suffer most from, were effectively grounded very early on by the Harrier pilots. The Royal Engineers are about to work on the runway so that British planes can land, a prospect that delights us all, especially the Marines and Paras, who still have hopes of seeing what's left of the British summer. And the tiny capital itself needs tidying up. The debris of war needs to be cleared away, the streets hosed down, and the houses searched for booby traps and other devices before families who evacuated to friends and relatives outside the town can return. The Falklanders are in need of financial and moral encouragement. They have been sorely tried.
Oh, it's been very long. It's been a very long time, it seemed like years. And you never knew from one day to the next whether your house would be safe or not, if you go home and you would find Argentines in it or not. So it was a very worrying time, and also we were very worried about the British troops and how they were faring in the fields. But we didn't have any doubts at all that they would get through in the end.
What did you think when the British went to begin with?
I'm afraid I cried. I cried a lot because, you know, Britain had gone and all we knew had gone, and there was just something totally new and unknown to us that arrived, and we never knew how they would treat us and what would become of us.
You see, we lived almost surrounded by the soldiers, which is known as the sort of military zone. And time again, I'd go to the door and I'd find 7 or 8, 9 soldiers standing there with guns and all sorts of excuses. I gave them a tape recorder. I tried to be as kind, as friendly as I did, and I waved to them because
You didn't know what was going to happen?
No.
Well,
no, and so when you find these people there, although they never hurt any civilians, not one, I don't think. But it's just so terrifying living and brought up in a British colony as we had been. Perhaps I shouldn't even say colony now. But we were so British, and then to find all these guns here, it was just terrifying. And I stood at the door and I used to cry and
Friday the 18th, and the first backfire of resentment. During the night, prisoners of war, 20, possibly more, broke away from their guards and set fire